The air that night felt heavy, like the desert itself was holding its breath. The neon diner sign flickered behind her as Valerie Kane locked the door for the last time. It was past 11, the highway almost empty except for the hum of a single truck disappearing into the dark. She tucked her tips into her apron, waved to the cook cleaning the grill, and started walking toward her car parked under the sodium lights. Valerie was 19, the kind of girl who kept her promises, even the small ones. She had told her mom she'd be home by midnight. She'd worked double shifts all week to save for fall tuition at Northern Arizona University. Her sneakers crunched against the gravel shoulder as she unlocked the driver's side door, humming a tune her father used to play on long drives. She called home before turning the key. Her mother, Elaine, answered half asleep. "Be careful, honey. The roads are quiet tonight." Valerie smiled. "I will, Mom. I'm 5 minutes out." It was the last thing she ever said. When the car was found, 2 hours later, the engine was still running. The driver's door hung open, the radio playing static from a dead channel. Her shoes, one lying upright, the other upside down, rested by the edge of the road as if she'd stepped right out of them. Her bag, still zipped, was inside the passenger seat. The police would later call it an isolated abduction. Elaine Kane called it something else, a nightmare that didn't wake up. By sunrise, her father, Robert, was standing in the same spot, calling her name into the wind until his voice broke. Neighbors, joined by mid-morning, flashlights sweeping the brush, volunteers shouting her name over the sound of the canyon wind. The only thing that answered was silence. For a moment, the world kept moving, cars passing, streetlights blinking, people going to work. But for the Kane family, time froze at the side of that road. By morning, the town of Flagstaff was already whispering. Word spread faster than fact. A missing girl, a car left running, and no trace of struggle. The sheriff's department arrived just after dawn, marking tire tracks and taping off the shoulder. But the longer they stood there, the clearer it became that no one really knew what to do. Elaine was pacing the kitchen floor when they told her to stay hopeful. Her hands trembled so badly she couldn't pour coffee. Robert slammed the phone down after his fourth unanswered call to the precinct. 48 hours, the officer said, before she's officially classified as missing. He stared at the receiver like it was speaking another language. 48 hours? For them, it had already been forever. That night, the Kane family held their first search alone. Flashlights flickered across the desert brush, cutting through dust and darkness. Elaine walked miles along the roadside, calling her daughter's name until her throat felt like sandpaper. Each car that passed slowed down for a moment, headlights sweeping over her, and then sped away. By the third night, she stopped, expecting help. Friends brought food that went untouched. Neighbors promised prayers that started sounding like apologies. Even the town's pastor came by to offer comfort, but Elaine couldn't hear him. "My daughter isn't a sermon," she whispered. "She's missing." 2 days later, a hiker found something near a dry ravine, a gold locket engraved with the letter V. Inside it, a faded picture of Elaine and Robert. Police bagged it carefully, saying it could be unrelated. Elaine pressed her hands against the evidence tape and whispered, "No, that's my baby." The press moved in, cameras flashing, and suddenly Valerie's name was everywhere. But the attention faded as fast as it came. By the end of the week, another headline had taken its place, and the Kane family was left standing under the same empty sky, wondering how a town could forget so quickly. The silence that followed became its own kind of violence, slow, invisible, and merciless. Have you ever had someone vanish between one breath and the next? She thought she was just going home, but home never came. Subscribe, because the next truth might be hiding right behind your own front door. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. By day 3, Flagstaff had turned into a storm of flashing lights and breaking news. Patrol cars lined Route 66, reporters circled like vultures, and every conversation began with the same phrase. "Did you hear about that girl?" Detectives Harlan Cooper and Denise Walsh were assigned to the case, both overworked, both exhausted before they even began. Cooper was the veteran of small-town policing, blunt, slow to trust. Walsh, newer, methodical, trying to apply logic to something that already felt senseless. Together they retraced Valerie Kane's last known steps: the diner, the parking lot, the highway shoulder. What they found was chaos disguised as evidence. 3 eyewitnesses came forward, each telling a different version of the truth. A truck driver swore he saw a red pickup pulled over behind Valerie's car. A college student insisted it was blue, and a retired couple claimed they saw a woman arguing with someone near the edge of the canyon trail. None of it fit cleanly, yet all of it demanded to be heard. The only physical evidence came from the car itself. Fingerprints smudged by curious onlookers, a single torn piece of fabric caught in the doorframe, and tire marks that disappeared into the dirt. The lab confirmed what everyone feared: the fabric had blood on it, but no way to identify whose. The technology of 1985 couldn't read what time would one day reveal. While police searched for clarity, the media searched for spectacle. Satellite trucks rolled into town, turning pain into headlines. Every broadcast used the same photos: Valerie's senior portrait, smiling in the sun, now framed beside the word "missing." Elaine couldn't bear to watch, but Robert sat through each report like it was punishment, waiting for one that would finally say, "Found." That hope didn't last long. By the end of the first week, the investigation was no longer about finding Valerie, it was about saving face. News anchors camped outside the Kane home. Reporters called the diner she'd worked at, pressing waitresses for gossip. The sheriff's office held a tense press briefing, trying to prove control while quietly losing it. That morning, Detective Cooper stood at the podium, sleeves rolled up, voice rough. "We are pursuing multiple leads," he said, the same sentence he'd repeated 3 times that week. But Robert Kane had heard enough. From the back of the room, he stood up, his voice cutting through the static microphones. "My daughter isn't a headline," he shouted. "Stop pretending you're helping if you're not even looking." Cameras swung toward him. The moment hit every television in Arizona by sundown. The next day, the family stopped receiving updates from the department. No more calls, no more visits, just silence. Behind closed doors, Walsh argued to keep working the case. Cooper didn't disagree, but their hands were tied by orders from above. Political pressure mounted as the city council demanded results. In the scramble to please headlines, a crucial piece of evidence: the blood-stained fabric went missing from the property locker for 48 hours before being logged again. When it returned, the sample had degraded beyond use. Walsh never forgave herself for that. Elaine began visiting the overlook every night after that. She'd light a small candle and set it on the guardrail, watching it flicker against the canyon's endless dark. "If she's out there," she whispered one night to her husband, "I don't want her to think we stopped looking." Robert didn't answer. He just pressed his hand over hers, staring into the black horizon that had swallowed his daughter whole. Back in the police station, Detective Cooper closed the case file after 6 months of chasing ghosts. "We've done everything we can," he muttered. Walsh didn't respond. She simply turned the desk lamp off and walked out, leaving the file half open, its yellow edges catching the last light of the evening sun. The next morning, Elaine's candle was still burning. The investigation went quiet, but grief stayed loud. Would you still believe in justice if every lead ended in silence? After the search ended, the desert reclaimed what it could. The ribbons from the missing posters turned to dust, the wooden stakes bleached white by the sun. By 1986, the Kane's yard, once filled with volunteers and candlelight, sat quiet except for the wind that never stopped howling through the trees. Robert returned to work at the lumber yard, though everyone knew he wasn't really there. He carried the same thermos every day, the same hollow stare. At night, he sat in Valerie's old room, turning her textbooks over like he could still feel the warmth from her hands. Elaine stopped sleeping altogether. The phone that never rang stayed plugged into the wall, as though hope depended on a dial tone. Years turned into layers. The flyers yellowed. The town moved on. Flagstaff grew brighter, newer, louder, new stores, new people, new stories. Valerie became a name, whispered by those who remembered, half remembered, or wanted to sound like they did. The locals called her the Canyon Girl. Robert died in 1999. His obituary was 3 sentences long, and none of them mentioned her. Elaine clipped it out anyway, folding it neatly beside Valerie's school photo. She didn't cry. She just said, "Now he knows," and kept the porch light on every night after that. She wrote a letter to the Flagstaff Police Department every year on her daughter's birthday. It always began the same. "To whoever is listening, please don't forget my Valerie." Most of the time, no one responded. A few years, a polite note arrived, usually signed by someone new, always saying the same thing: "We'll look into it when resources allow." But no one did. Until 2021. 36 years later, a dusty cardboard box sat on the bottom shelf of an evidence locker, tucked between old drug seizures and unsolved burglaries. The faded tag read VK85. It hadn't been touched in decades. Inside were the things no one wanted to remember: a weathered scarf, a torn Polaroid, a single strand of hair sealed in a plastic sleeve. Detective Amira Lowe stood in the cold room, her gloves squeaking against the tape as she opened it. The air smelled like paper, metal, and old grief. She had been 6 years old when Valerie disappeared, too young to understand fear, but old enough to feel it in her parents' warnings: "Don't walk home alone." Now, as part of Flagstaff's newly revived cold case unit, Lowe had made it her mission to give forgotten names a voice again. She'd reopened 10 cases in 2 years. None had prepared her for this one. As she read through the handwritten notes, she realized how much had been lost to time. The police reports were smudged. The photographs had faded. One page mentioned blood-stained fabric. Another noted possible foreign DNA. But there was no record of testing beyond 1,986. Lowe felt anger burn low in her chest. How many people had walked past this box? How many desks had it sat under? At the bottom, she found something that shouldn't have been there: a letter. It wasn't filed or dated, just folded neatly inside the evidence sleeve. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine, looping and careful. "If you ever find this, please don't let her be forgotten. E.K." End quote. Elaine Kane's handwriting. Lowe pressed the letter flat against the table, her throat tightening. That small, fragile note, written by a mother who'd probably long given up hope, hit harder than any case file ever could. "You weren't forgotten," she whispered. "Not anymore." The next day, she filed the request to have every item retested using the department's new forensic technology. It wasn't a formality, it was a promise. For nearly 40 years, her killer lived free, smiling through every storm. If he could hide that long, who could be hiding near you? Time didn't bury her story. It just waited for someone to listen again. Detective Amira Lowe stared at the blood-stained fabric laid out under sterile lights. The crime lab was silent, except for the hum of the machines that had replaced what used to be called luck. She couldn't shake the thought someone, somewhere, had walked free, while this tiny scrap of evidence waited to be heard. When she signed the authorization for advanced touch DNA analysis, her hand trembled slightly. After decades of silence, this was the first time Valerie's case had moved forward in years. The sample was degraded, fragile, and smaller than a fingernail clipping, but the technology had changed. The machine didn't need much, just a few skin cells clinging to the fabric's weave. Days turned into nights. Every call from the lab made Lowe's heart pound. When the results finally came back, the analyst looked at her not with celebration, but with quiet awe. "We got something," he said softly. "It's partial, but it's human. Male." Lowe exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. For 36 years, the evidence had been a ghost, and now it was whispering. The DNA wasn't enough to name a suspect, but it was enough to build a web. Lowe requested permission to submit the profile to forensic genealogy databases, the kind used to track ancestry and distant relatives. 2 weeks later, a notification pinged her computer screen, a familial hit. The name beside it made her stomach twist. Merrill. At first, she thought it had to be wrong. The Merrills weren't just another Flagstaff family, they were legacy. They owned half the auto shops in the county. They sponsored every parade, every charity run, every welcome home sign for soldiers returning from duty. Still, she followed procedure. Cross-referencing public records, she traced the line down 3 generations until she reached Dean Merrill, 63 years old, a retired mechanic who, in 1985, had worked just 2 blocks from the diner where Valerie Kane had spent her final night alive. She sat back in her chair, the file open before her. Photos of Dean at community events, smiling with police chiefs, shaking hands with mayors, filled the screen. He looked like the kind of man people trusted, the kind of man you never questioned. Lo's pulse kicked up. She printed the file, every page rustling like accusation. For nearly 40 years, this man had walked free under the same sky that had hidden Valerie's screams. But she didn't feel triumph. She felt the weight of the town's denial pressing on her chest. "He's one of us," her captain warned quietly when she brought the evidence forward. "He was," Lo said, "but so was she." The department's response was cautious, too cautious. Lo felt it in every sideways glance, every polite suggestion to double-check the results. To most of Flagstaff, the Merrills were untouchable. Their family name was stitched into the fabric of the town. Old money, old respect, old connections. Accusing one of them wasn't just bold, it was almost unthinkable. But Lo had seen this before, the quiet protection that privilege builds, the way truth gets buried under the weight of community pride. She'd spent her entire career digging through those layers. She pushed for a surveillance warrant, unmarked cars, unlisted hours. No one outside her small team could know. Within days, Merrill's routines unfolded like clockwork. Morning coffee at the same diner, a stop at the auto parts store, afternoons tending to his workshop behind the family garage. That workshop, Lo noted, was only 3 blocks from where Valerie Kane vanished in 1985. It took less than a week to get what she needed. Merrill tossed his coffee cup into a trash bin outside the shop. Within hours, it sat sealed in an evidence bag under her arm. The lab fast-tracked the test. When the results came back, no one said a word they didn't have to. The DNA on the coffee cup matched the partial sample from the blood-stained fabric perfectly. Lo's hands trembled as she read the report. The desert hadn't forgotten, she whispered. It had been holding the truth beneath its own dust. Outside the lab window, the wind carried the dry scent of earth, the same air Valerie had breathed that night. Lo felt something shift deep inside her, a mix of fury and vindication. For nearly 40 years, silence had ruled this town. But now, the desert was speaking again through her. Would you want science to tell you that the person you trusted most was lying for 40 years? The desert hadn't forgotten it had been holding the truth beneath its own dust. Dean Merrill had the kind of reputation that made people feel safe just by standing near him. The kind of man who waved to every neighbor, sponsored Little League uniforms, and led Sunday prayers at the First Baptist Church. To Flagstaff, he wasn't just a respected mechanic, he was a cornerstone. He'd lived through decades of town changes, his name quietly stitched into charity boards, school fundraisers, and church bulletins. When his wife died in 2009, the whole community turned out for the funeral casseroles, condolences, and quiet admiration for how gracefully he endured tragedy. To them, Dean Merrill was decency personified. But to Detective Amira Lo, he was now a name attached to a DNA match that shouldn't have existed. She watched him from a distance one morning, seated in his truck outside the diner where Valerie once worked. He sipped his coffee, greeted the staff by name, and tipped generously. She wrote every motion down not because she needed the evidence, but because she couldn't reconcile what she saw with what she knew. "How many times," she whispered, "did you walk by that girl before you decided she wouldn't make it home?" Lo had seen monsters before. But Merrill was worse. He was ordinary. The kind of ordinary that makes people blind. When the archive clerk handed Lo the old newspaper box marked 1985 Kane case file, she thought she was ready. She wasn't. Inside were photos from Valerie's vigil, hundreds of faces holding candles under the Arizona night sky. Faces worn with grief, anger, and disbelief. Faces of a town that wanted to believe they were safe again. And there, standing in the middle of it all, candle in hand, was Dean Merrill. His expression wasn't grief, it was calm, detached. He was the man comforting others, the man who organized carpool rides for volunteers, the man who helped set up the stage for the very speech condemning Valerie's killer. Lo froze, staring at his face in the faded photo. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't just guilt that made the picture unbearable, it was the audacity. "You stood there," she said under her breath, her voice low, shaking. "You watched them cry. You lit a candle for the life you took." That night, she drove home in silence. Her radio stayed off. Her thoughts wouldn't. The weight of the truth pressed down harder than any case she'd worked before. This wasn't just a murderer, it was someone the entire town had trusted, respected, even admired. Every handshake, every sermon, every act of kindness was a layer of disguise that no one had dared to peel back. But she would. Because Valerie Kane's name didn't belong to the dust, it belonged to the truth. Detective Lowe didn't sleep that night. Her living room floor was covered with photos, case notes, and a single name underlined over and over: Dean Merrill. She replayed the facts like a storm she couldn't shut off. The DNA match, the vigil photo, his proximity to the diner. Every line led back to him. The man who baptized children, fixed their parents' cars, and stood over a mother's shoulder while she begged for justice. When the morning came, she called her captain. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "It's him," she said simply. "It's Merrill." The silence on the other end said everything. No disbelief, no denial, just the quiet weight of a truth that would destroy a town's illusion. By noon, she was sitting across from Elaine Kane, the woman who'd waited 38 years for someone to tell her what she already knew in her bones. Lowe couldn't find the right words, so she just told the truth, raw, unpolished, human. Elaine didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just stared out the window, her voice soft but edged with finality. "He prayed for forgiveness every Sunday," she whispered, "for a sin no one knew he'd committed." It was the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a wound that would never stop remembering. Outside, church bells rang, the same ones Dean Merrill had listened to for 40 years. Each toll sounded less like grace and more like an echo of everything he'd stolen. Lowe walked away from that meeting with one thought carved into her heart. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about truth, finally speaking loud enough for the dead to rest. He prayed for forgiveness every Sunday for a sin no one knew he'd committed. What if the man you trusted to lead prayers was the one they were meant for? It was still dark when the unmarked cars rolled down Pine Hollow Road. The air hung heavy, carrying the kind of stillness that comes before an earthquake. No sirens, no shouting, just quiet movement, deliberate, rehearsed. At exactly 5:42 a.m., a knock echoed through the modest brick home of Dean Merrill. 3 sharp taps that would end nearly 40 years of false peace. He opened the door in his robe, confused but calm. The man who had prayed over so many funerals now faced his own reckoning. "Dean Merrill," the lead officer said, "you're under arrest for the murder of Valerie Kane." Neighbors peered through curtains, stunned into silence. For years, they'd waved to this man every Sunday morning. He'd mowed lawns for the elderly, donated to school drives, even paid for a few kids' prom tickets. Now they watched him being led away in handcuffs. Across town, the bells from the same church he'd once led began to ring their echo, bouncing off the red clay hills like a requiem for trust itself. By sunrise, the streets were alive with whispers. Phones rang, messages poured. Disbelief spread faster than the news itself. "It can't be him," one woman said. "He baptized my son. He helped me fix my roof." Another whispered, "He wasn't that kind of man." But truth doesn't ask for permission to arrive. It simply shows up and forces everyone to look. The team entered Merrill's home with quiet, precision gloves on. cameras rolling, hearts heavy. Nothing about the place screamed guilt. The living room looked ordinary, almost sterile. Family photos lined the walls, Bible verses framed in neat gold trim. But upstairs, in a back room he'd once called his study, the illusion fell apart. Inside an old cedar chest were things no innocent man would keep. Detective Lowe knelt down, pulling out a brittle envelope labeled 1,985 personal. Inside were diner receipts from the night Valerie vanished, folded so tightly the ink had nearly faded. Beneath that, a delicate silver chain, broken, tarnished, and unmistakably female. And at the bottom of the box, inside a rusted tin, was the object that stopped Lowe cold. A single car key, still attached to a faded plastic tag that read, Kane Diner Employee Parking Lot. For a long moment, no one spoke. Lowe stared at it, every muscle locked in disbelief. She had read the report. Valerie's car door had been found open, keys missing. The case file described it in detail. Now here it was, tucked away like a souvenir of arrogance. One of the techs whispered, "He kept it all these years." Lowe didn't answer. Her eyes swept the room, the sermon notes on his desk, the stack of unmailed church bulletins, the open Bible on the nightstand. She could almost feel the weight of his hypocrisy pressing in from every side. Every sermon he preached, every prayer he offered, it was all built on a lie buried in his own house. When the evidence bags filled and the photographs were cataloged, Lowe stood by the doorway, staring at the light seeping through the blinds. "The house of God doesn't forgive what's built on secrets," she muttered. That night, the photo of the evidence table, diner receipts, chain, and car key went viral. Headline after headline screamed across the nation. Church leader charged in 1985. Murder. Flagstaff's faith shattered by arrest. The story spread beyond Arizona, a symbol of how long evil can wear a friendly face. When the phone rang that morning, Elaine Kane almost didn't answer. At 83, her world had shrunk to soft routines, the creak of her porch swing, the smell of desert rain, and the framed photo of Valerie that never left her kitchen table. But when she picked up, her hands trembled before she even heard the words. "Mrs. Kane," Detective Lowe said softly, "we've arrested Dean Merrill." The silence that followed felt like the air itself had stopped breathing. Elaine pressed the receiver to her chest, eyes wet, throat dry. The man who'd stood beside her at every vigil, the one who'd hugged her after church and whispered, "She's with God now," had been the devil in her living room all along. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "He prayed with me." Lowe hesitated, but she didn't lie. "I know." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Elaine let out a sound, half sob, half relief. It was the sound of 40 years collapsing into a single truth. Later that day, she sat by Valerie's old dresser, touching the brush her daughter used to comb her hair before night shifts. Outside, news vans crowded her street. She didn't watch the coverage. She didn't need to. She'd always known. Her only words to the reporters gathered outside were calm, but sharp enough to pierce the air. "He lit candles for her memory," she said. "But he's the one who blew her light out." When she closed the door, she leaned against it, eyes lifted upward not to heaven, but to memory. In that moment, Flagstaff's grief had a face again. Not of the girl who vanished, but of a mother who never stopped waiting. By morning, the town square looked like a stage for disbelief. News vans lined the streets. Reporters swarmed the courthouse. Locals huddled outside coffee shops, whispering in voices that trembled between rage and denial. "Is greater than, he baptized my niece. He fixed my alternator for free. He held our hands when the Thompson boy died. How could it be him?" Every voice carried the same haunting thread. They all knew Dean Merrill. He wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. He was the man who blessed their meals, who led their community drives, who stood at every funeral promising comfort. And that realization that evil could live inside something so ordinary cracked the foundation of trust in ways no one could repair. At the local church, parishioners removed his photo from the wall, It had hung there for 30 years, smiling, honored. Now it sat face down in the trash. The pastor's sermon that Sunday was brief, his voice shaking. "We are a town built on faith," he said. "But today, we face the cost of blind faith." Some defended Merrill people who couldn't bear the thought that their world had been so wrong. Others demanded justice louder than ever. The divide cut through families, through friendships, through pews that once sat side by side. Detective Lowe watched it all unfold quietly from her car near City Hall. She'd seen killers before, but never one that shattered a community's very definition of good. For the Kane family, the news was vindication. For Flagstaff, it was exposure. The story forced every resident to confront a single, unbearable truth. Evil doesn't always live far away. Sometimes, it waves to you from across the street. That night, as the cameras dimmed and reporters packed their gear, Elaine's porch light burned brighter than it had in years, a single beacon cutting through the desert dark. The arrest wasn't closure. It was the beginning of accountability. And for the first time in nearly 40 years, Valerie's name was spoken not as legend, but as justice. The courthouse was silent except for the faint hum of ceiling lights and the scratching of pens against paper. Every seat was filled, townspeople, reporters, former parishioners, all staring at the man who'd once been the symbol of goodness in Flagstaff. Dean Merrill shuffled into the courtroom in a gray suit that hung too loose, his once steady hands now trembling slightly. The man who used to comfort the grieving now faced their eyes. When the judge asked how he would plead, Merrill didn't lift his head. "Is greater than Your Honor," his attorney said quietly. "The defendant enters an Alford plea." It meant no admission of guilt, only acknowledgement that the evidence against him was impossible to refute. The courtroom murmured. People wanted words, a confession, a breakdown, a shred of humanity. But they got silence instead. Merrill never looked at the Kane family, never apologized. He stared forward, hollow-eyed, as the prosecutor read aloud the findings, Valerie's DNA on his jacket, her car key in his possession, the eyewitness statements that finally made sense after decades of being ignored. Detective Lowe sat in the witness box, hands folded, gaze steady. This was her last case, her final act before retirement. And though she'd imagined this moment for years, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like completion, a circle drawn painfully slow. When asked for her statement, Lowe spoke plainly. "Justice isn't about vengeance," she said. "It's about remembering who we failed and refusing to fail them again." Her words cut through the still air, like truth finally unbound. Elaine Kane rose slowly, each step toward the podium echoing through the courtroom. The years had bent her frame, but not her will. She clutched a small piece of folded paper, though everyone could see she didn't need it. She turned first to the judge, then to the man who'd taken everything from her. Her voice, soft but unwavering, filled the air. "You didn't just steal her life," she said, every syllable trembling with both fury and grace. "You borrowed 40 years of peace from me, from her father, from this town." Merrill didn't move. He stared down at the defense table, his hands folded as if in mock prayer. Elaine continued. "You stood in our home. You hugged me after church. You told me God would take care of her." Her words cracked, but she pressed on. "I used to think forgiveness was the only way to heal. But forgiveness doesn't mean silence. And today, I'm speaking for her. For every night I waited for a knock on my door that never came." The room was so quiet that the faint buzz of a camera lens adjusting could be heard. She took a deep breath, eyes burning with tears that refused to fall. "You may walk into whatever years you have left without saying her name, but I'll make sure the world never forgets it." And with that, she turned back toward her seat. The audience didn't applaud, they stood. Not out of spectacle, but out of reverence. Detective Lowe bowed her head, whispering Valerie's name under her breath, a silent promise fulfilled. Even the judge, his voice thick, paused before speaking. "Mrs. Kane," he said quietly, "your daughter's name will stay in this record forever. For Elaine, that was enough. When the gavel struck, the sound wasn't sharp. It was heavy, like the last shovel of earth, laid over a long-buried truth. Life in prison, no possibility of parole. Dean Merrill didn't flinch. He didn't speak. His silence was all that was left of him, a hollow echo of a man stripped of every illusion of decency. For the people of Flagstaff, the sentence carried a weight far greater than punishment. It was a mirror, forcing them to face the blindness that had let evil thrive right in front of them. The church issued a statement that afternoon, acknowledging its failure to see. Local papers that once praised Merrill for his devotion to faith and community now carried a headline soaked in reckoning: "Trust betrayed. Flagstaff's longest night finally ends." Outside the courthouse, Elaine stood surrounded by microphones, but said only one thing: "I'm not angry anymore. I'm tired. But she can rest now." Those words spread faster than any headline. That night, candles lit the courthouse steps once again, but this time, it wasn't for mourning. It was for acknowledgement, for survival. Detective Lowe lingered at the edge of the crowd, watching families hug, strangers cry, and old wounds knit themselves into quiet strength. After 40 years of grief, this wasn't celebration, it was relief. The people of Flagstaff finally spoke her name without flinching. "Valerie Kane," Lowe whispered to herself. "You're home." And as the wind swept across the desert, it felt as though the town itself exhaled. The nightmare had ended. The memory would not. The gavel didn't close her story. It made sure no one could rewrite it again. A year after the sentencing, the streets of Flagstaff looked different. Not louder, not busier, just more aware. The canyon highway where Valerie disappeared had been repaved, its faded mile markers replaced with a small sign that read simply, "In memory of Valerie Kane, loved, missed, never forgotten." It wasn't grand, but it was enough. The town that once whispered her name now spoke it with respect. Students at Northern Arizona University wore small blue ribbons during finals week, a tribute to her dream of becoming a teacher, a dream stolen but remembered. Detective Amira Lowe retired quietly that spring. She turned down interviews, honors, and documentaries. Her only public statement came during a local radio segment when she was asked why she'd spent years chasing a ghost everyone else had stopped believing in. "Because she was someone's whole world," Lowe said softly. "And that's enough reason for anyone." Those words sparked something unexpected, a movement. Community leaders, survivors, and college students joined forces to create the Valerie Kane Foundation for Women's Safety, an initiative offering self-defense workshops, late-night campus escorts, and funding for cold case DNA testing across Arizona. It started as a single meeting in a church basement. Within a year, it was a statewide campaign. The first check written in Valerie's name wasn't for flowers or memorial stones. It was for lab equipment to give other families the closure Elaine Kane fought for nearly half a century to find. Because justice, they decided, shouldn't depend on luck or time. It should depend on persistence. Elaine Kane didn't live long enough to see the foundation's second year, but her final act left an imprint deeper than any headline. When she passed away in 2024, the town gathered at the small park near the canyon, overlooked the same place she had once stood alone, holding a candle for a daughter who never came home. This time, she wasn't alone. The community that once forgot her pain now stood shoulder to shoulder in silence. Detectives, reporters, teachers, and mothers all carrying candles that flickered against the dusky Arizona sky. At the park's center, the city unveiled a bronze plaque on a stone pedestal. The inscription read, "Truth takes time, but it never loses its way home. Elaine Kane, 1939, 2024. The crowd didn't clap, they bowed their heads. Detective Lowe, standing at the edge of the memorial, placed her badge beside the plaque, a quiet retirement gift to the woman whose strength outlasted generations. She whispered, "You did it, Elaine. You brought her home." For a moment, the canyon wind picked up, rustling through the trees, bending the candle flames but not snuffing them out. It felt like an answer, soft, unseen, but certain. From that day forward, the park became more than a place of grief. It became a symbol of return proof that even when decades pass, the truth always finds a way back. Every June, they held the candlelight walk in Valerie's honor. The path wound through the park, across the bridge, and down the same road she once took home. Parents walked with their children. Survivors held hands. College students carried photos of missing persons whose stories were still waiting to be told. And as the candles moved in unison across the twilight, the town finally glowed for the right reason. The sun sank behind the San Francisco peaks, painting the Arizona sky in bands of gold and rust. The canyon breathed with the low hum of the evening wind, that soft desert whisper that always seemed to carry something unspoken. Detective Amira Lowe stood alone at the overlook, the same ridge where Elaine once waited night after night. She looked out over the endless sprawl of rock and sky, her reflection caught faintly in the bronze plaque beside her. The candlelight walk had ended hours earlier, but one flame still burned near her feet, a single votive left by a little girl who had whispered, "This one's for Valerie." Lowe smiled sadly. She reached down, cupping her hand around the flame to protect it from the wind. "You're still here," she murmured. Behind her, the city lights of Flagstaff shimmered steady, alive. The same city that once turned away now carried her memory in every street, every heart that had learned what silence costs. The sound of footsteps broke her thought, a young officer approaching, nervous and respectful. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "we're locking up for the night." She nodded, taking one last look toward the canyon. "She waited long enough," Lowe said. "Let's let her rest." As she walked back toward her car, the wind carried faint echoes, not words, not a voice, just the rhythm of something eternal, a name that refused to die in the dust. In a city of thousands, one young woman refused to be forgotten. And because she held on, so did justice.